The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host. We'll be starting a new trilogy today. I'll be sharing a story from book 3, my most recent of the 3 books in the Afterlife Interrupted series. This one is called Dr. Lawrence, Long Illness, Mary, Angel, Abel, and the Parents. If you've followed the podcast or read or listened to the books, you know that the phenomenon for me that's been going on for close to 30 years now is that about once a week, somebody shows up in my dreamscape, really at my invitation. Before I go to sleep, I let it be known to the Holy Spirit that I'm available if needed. And about once a week, I'm used to having somebody come in with a dream story that very often gives me the basic details of a life that ended suddenly and violently. So a lot of car crashes, shootings, stabbings, drownings, suicides, but very rarely physical illness. I very rarely get sudden seizures, heart attacks, that kind of thing, but that can happen. The story that I'm going to tell today wasn't sudden. In fact, Dr. Lawrence suffered a long, slow, debilitating illness. It was, he was late in his life. He was a college professor, and he was experiencing physical decline, not uncommon to anyone aging, but he broke a hip. Sometimes people say that he fell and broke his hip. Sometimes the hip breaks and you fall. My early background educationally was in gerontology as an undergrad, and that's where I learned about that very often the bone breaks. It's especially common in women that have osteoporosis late in life, where the bone just fails, and then a fall ensues, and then after that, there's need for surgeries, and that happened to him. He had a surgery to, replace the hip, and they gave him prior to going into surgery a series of possibilities of what might come next. And of course, they tried to give him the most optimistic outcome of the physical therapy that would follow the surgery and what the possible upward trajectory might be. He was a college professor, and so he thought of it as like grading on a bell curve, that in a group of people, they're describing all kinds of people that have had falls that included a broken hip and a subsequent surgery, a scale of possible outcomes. It's just that he was used to succeeding at things. He explained to us that early in his life, well, first of all, he was the only child of 2 very well-educated parents who wanted other children and never were able to successfully have them. And so he said they poured all kind of educational resources into me. He said, and not only did the schooling that all other children did, but after school there were always music lessons and other kinds of tutoring. He said outings were usually to a museum or to some other place that had a very explicit educational component to the outing. He just was somebody that was used to acquiring more and more learning and being good at it. If there was any kind of a bell curve where he was compared to other people, he was usually used to being at the most positive end of it. So he hoped for that for his hip surgery, but his body just didn't cooperate. He didn't bounce back from that fall and the surgery, and in fact, he ended up being more decrepit than ever and moving from relative independence to almost complete dependence on others for all kinds of things, including self-care. So he was largely bedridden or maybe able to move a bit from the bed to the toilet to the shower, that sort of thing. But his life became very, very conscribed by illness. And most of his company was healthcare workers. So this story is different in that it describes that kind of circumstance rather than a sudden death in a car accident, for example. This one came almost 2 years ago. I'm recording this at the beginning of November of 2024, and this dream came in January of 2023. So we're coming up on a couple of years back. The dream that I wrote down just said, I was an old man in a bed in my home. Someone, a nice lady, was shampooing my hair in my bed. Then I had to walk past a lot of clutter to get to the bathroom to rinse off the shampoo, and I awoke. So, as is always the case with these, I just try to be a faithful reporter of what I observed, what I saw in the dream, wrote it down, met with a prayer partner, Karen, one of my most kind of faithful, stalwart prayer partners. We met not very long after the dream. It was I said it was January 7th of 2023 that I received it, and it was only a month later that we went into prayer and dealt with it. This one was lovely. Our process is that we pray in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Karen is Christian. She's I think Methodist. Um, but we go into prayer. We invite saints and angels to be with us. I always start with Saint Michael the Archangel because he's heaven's protector, and I don't move into that spiritual space until we're first sure that we're held secure. Uh, I was involved, Mary, the mother of Jesus, right away too. I've loved her for a lifetime, and within our faith, she's thought of as being a very gracious, loving presence that that any kind of evil flees from, just because of her goodness and gentleness. Anyway, as it turned out, that's what we did, and the very I after reading the story a couple of times to Karen slowly to let it kind of sink into us and get our imaginations ready to accommodate the person that we're trying to help. We very often ask for their guardian to give us some clarity because dreams of their nature sometimes have symbology or in some ways indistinct, and we like to get some clarity. Well, this time, it's before the before the guardian angel could even show up, Mary, the mother of Jesus, who we had just asked to be there, showed up. She does that sometimes, and she's not always surrounded by a blare of trumpets or, a parade of angels or anything. She just comes where she's welcome, and she did that very simply. But she let me know she wanted to speak first, and so I told Karen it's going to be Mother Mary, and she said, "I've been present to your conversation that you've been having about Father Nathan being overly busy. For whatever reason, at that particular time, I felt my life and my schedule was uh, cluttered. There was just a lot of different details that needed my attention, and I was felt like I was running in circles. Sometimes I get that way. Maybe you do too. Um, anyway, I felt clutter in my imagination, in my consciousness, my spirit. And Mother Mary shows up and says, I wonder if you've ever seen me depicted with a broom in hand. And Karen said, no, I don't think so. She said, well, probably not, but I was a wife, a mother, and a housekeeper. Hardly a day went by when there wasn't the need to sweep and tidy. Isn't that funny? I'm doing a little of that inside Father Nathan because, as you just heard, he feels like there's rather a lot of clutter around him. It makes him feel hemmed in. And so when he was doing a little bit of deep breathing just a moment ago, I was trying to help him push aside things to make space to do today's work. That's my life. And I'm just telling you what my experience is. And I don't read an awful lot into that. believe the saints and angels are present to all of us in whatever ways we invite and in whatever ways they please. So I don't mean to make a big deal of it. It's just what happened. And I love her dearly, and she knows that that's true, and that we've loved each other for, I'm 68 years old, for a very long time. Anyway, she didn't stay long, but she said, you might think of the time that I lived here on the earth as a very simple time, and you might think your modern complex world of multitasking and heavy agendas is so different. It's true that our lives were organized differently, but there were certainly plenty of times when we felt like there was more to do than there were hours in the day. That's not a 21st century phenomenon, is it? Can't you imagine people that lived very long ago feeling like they had more work to do than they could do in a day? She said, it's not an unfamiliar emotion, but for the task at hand, I'm just trying to clear a path. It doesn't all need to be put away this minute, but there does need to be enough space for him to do the task at hand. So that she described it as sweeping inside of me, which I appreciated. Um, she thanked us for what we're doing, and she said, we're grateful for this work. We're aware of his workload. We're also aware that he's also aware that if he just continues to walk in faith, there will be more and more help provided along the way. So with that, I'm sliding aside, and the guardian is on their way. So she wasn't here for more than a minute or two, and I've just read to you what she said. But she helped me calm down inside and make space so that the work that we do could proceed as it ought. So the guardian came next. She slid aside, and then the guardian's name was Angel Abel. And they always take, or I found at least in recent years, they take a name that has some pertinence to the story that's unfolding. And Abel, Abel, sounds like to be able, Able. And the guardian said, I'm taking that name partly to assure Father Nathan that he is able today. And then he went on to say that that was part of the issue with the one that he guarded was disability. But he was coming as Angel Able. And he offered this point of view. Remember that the angels don't have gender, but they do present as masculine or feminine according to which they think is the better descriptor of them. And he chose masculine. Um, he said that it's not an unfamiliar feeling to have a sense of reaching one's capacity or pushing against it. Sometimes that can be frantic, unhelpful, or counterproductive. Other times it just seems like a natural process of expansion. And then Angel Abel kind of quoted me because I often, when I'm teaching crowds, groups, I remind them that the universe that we live in is expanding, and that if we're universal people, we naturally take part in an expansive process. That um, we don't need to be afraid of changing or growing or having our world expand because it's just natural that it do so, unless we prevent it or try to prevent it. So he says sometimes when we expand, we pop. Jesus spoke of a seed needing to break open so that it can bear 30, 60, or 100-fold. It might just be that Nathan is at a moment of that kind of breaking open, but that it's momentary. I thought that was really eloquent, which is why I'm bothering to pass it along to you and even quote him, because it might pertain to you. There might be times when you feel like you're simply overwhelmed by more than you can do, and that's discouraging. That certainly happens. And sometimes that's all it is. But there might be other times in your life where there is some sort of convergence of things that makes you feel beyond your strength, pushed or pulled in different ways. And sometimes that can be indicative of being at a crossroads in one's life, that it might be that there's a need for you to break open in some way and have a breakthrough of a different way of thinking or of handling things or something of that order. Anyway, Karen just said that makes sense. Well, finally, we get around not to just me and my cluttered head, the consciousness, but we get on to Dr. Lawrence. That's where we learn about who he is. And I gave you some of those details already. Um, anyway, he did come on the line and he spoke, and we learned that Lawrence was his surname, he said. And he explained to us that his was not a religious family, but they exposed him to the world of ideas and intellectual life. And so he said the questions that religious people often are asking through a religious lens, a framework of how did we get here? What is this place? What's our purpose or destiny? He said these kinds of things that sometimes are answered within religious practice. He said, I was aware of them and I thought of them in my own way, even though I wasn't a religious man who practiced a religious faith. But he said it was interesting to him to try to understand people who did approach those questions through an organized religion. He had done a little study of comparative religion. Um, anyway, he said, I'm being verbose. Uh, he uh, he said, I didn't retire into leisure. I retired into ill health. Well, as I mentioned, a fall, a subsequent surgery, uh, uh, poor response physically to physical therapy, and then more decrepitude, really until he died. He also told us that he died in his sleep and that when he awoke, he was in circumstances very much like what he had left behind. And it took him some time to come to the awareness through the help of others in the afterlife that he had in fact died. But there wasn't for him a breaking into uh, some afterlife marvels or anything. He kind of just woke up into something like the uh, nursing home room that he had been in before. He said, I felt so caged. And he said, it turns out that I gave up using my imagination. I think that's real important. And I'll go into that in one of the next couple of, or maybe both of the next two episodes in this trilogy. I'm only telling the story today, and we'll go into compassionate response and spiritual practice in the next two podcasts. Anyway, he said that he had largely stopped using his imagination because he couldn't imagine anything that was anything except this cluttery, sad life that he had in a decrepit body in a nursing home room. But it was his imagination that he had quit using. So it was quitting using one's imagination might be like allowing a muscle to atrophy. That's why even for people that don't have very much likelihood of a robust, healthy recovery from a late in life illness, they're still made to walk and move and stuff so that the muscles that they do have and the strength that they continue to have doesn't atrophy for disuse. Anyway, he told us that he arrived in an afterlife circumstance that wasn't very different from what he had left, but people had to uh, remind him of things, and they said, "We want you to pay attention to the fact that you don't have to stay this way." And they asked him, you didn't maybe practice a organized religion, but you were around people who did. Did you ever hear of anyone who thought that they would survive into a heaven, who thought they would do so in a nursing home room? And he said, no, of course not. I never thought of anybody that wanted to be in a wheelchair in heaven or a potty chair. And they laughed. And he said that they said to him, we're going to need to get you up and about, re-engaging your life and re-engaging your imagination. But you're going to find that every bit of exertion that you put forth is going to be fruitful. That was part of the problem. He did cooperate with physical therapy before he died, but it didn't really accomplish much of anything. And he was discouraged and gave up. Well, they said, well, here you're going to find that for every bit of effort you put forward, there's going to be fruit. You're going to get stronger. And then he said there was something very analogous to what might have happened in a successful physical therapy regimen, that he could, get up and move about the room and eventually make it down the hallway, and maybe sit in the solarium and hear the birds outside, and eventually be up out of a wheelchair and able to move about and maybe even leave. He said that might have been the outcome that he never got, but that in the afterlife it began to be that way. And then I guess people who he called his intellectual peers began to come around. And one of them he described being an older person in the way that he appeared and said, "Watch me. Watch what our bodies can do, because they're not the same. They're analogous to what the bodies we were in before on the earth, but they're not the same. Watch me." So he got Professor Lawrence to pay close attention, and he said, right in front of me, he turned about 40 years younger. And he asked me, he said, if you had your own preference, can you think of an age in your life that you would like to be again? What was a really good time in your life? And Professor Lawrence, Dr. Lawrence said, I think maybe 35. That's when I finished my PhD and I was launching my career. I think 35 would be fun. And so they said, no, let's try that. And he succeeded at it for a moment. And but it only lasted a moment. And then they told him, we'll work with you, and we'll time you. And every time you do it in the future that you put forth the imagination and the effort, you'll stay younger for a longer period of time. So, incremental growth, that the way that often happens in any kind of therapeutic discipline. Um, and he said it wasn't that arduous and strenuous. It wasn't something that I dreaded doing the way that you might dread doing your exercises, especially if they cause you pain. Um, he said, um, while I was doing them, I would be free of pain, and I would have none of the affect, the surroundings of elderly ill health. He said it wasn't hard to do the therapy. I liked doing it, and I could see immediate progress, and I was encouraged. And then his imagination began to be re-energized. He could imagine getting better and better and better, which he hadn't been able to do before. And then he began to imagine that there could be a day, and they told him there can be a day soon where you don't need to be here at all and where you can go on to better things. So he explained that process. And of course, he didn't come to us until that process was already well down the line, where we think of ourselves as the discharge staff in some sort of an afterlife healthcare or uh, uh, healing process. Um, when Catholics think of it, they often use the word purgatory, which means to cleanse. That's one metaphor. Um, Another metaphor might be to gain spiritual strength or to come to greater truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, he says. And Professor Lawrence needed to rediscover the truth that his imagination was still there and still his to use if he chose to. It's just that he had quit using it before his death, and now he had the opportunity to reclaim it. Anyway, he got to the edge with us, and then he he was still to see who might come for him, and he had already had visitors of earlier in his story, but today on his crossing, it was his own parents. He said they were rather buttoned down. They had only me, and they were academics, and they were rather buttoned down. That's the word, the adjective that he used to describe them. And he said they're showing up with these novelty glasses that are black horn rimmed glasses with a little mustache. Well, he was borrowing from, or they were borrowing from a memory of mine. And I explained it in the story. My dad died of Parkinson's disease over a 10-year period, and he was in a sick bed for about the last 2 years. And he was in dementia uh, created by his Parkinsonian, the way that his disease progressed. When he was a healthier, younger man, I learned about men going to funerals wearing dark glasses on a sunny day or on a cloudy day uh, to hide the fact that they were crying, that their eyes were red. You've probably seen that. I hadn't until my dad's friend died, and he wore dark glasses in the house. Um, anyway, the when my dad did die, I had flown home to Texas, and I'm one of five kids, and all the siblings were arriving at different times from wherever we flew in from or drove in from. And it seemed like every time the door would open, there'd be a fresh round of crying with somebody new. And my two sisters arrived at the same time. And when we opened the door to them, they both had these glasses on. They wanted to honor Dad, who was a prankster, with a prank. And they wanted it known that they want the fact that they showed up to cause a fresh round of crying. So that was just, and in fact, what I preached my dad's funeral. I was standing right at the head of his casket with my family in the front row. And when it came time for me to preach the homily, they all put glasses on, the funny novelty glasses, because they didn't want me crying while I was trying to preach. So that was a story from my own memory and my own being. But when I allow somebody to be co-conscious with me, I make available whatever they want. Uh, and his parents, Dr. Lawrence's parents, plucked that out of me, and they put them on. And he was surprised, because he said my parents really didn't do anything frivolous like that. It just wasn't their way. But they're trying to show me that, in addition to the version of them that I was so familiar with in life, that they also now have something of a comic side, or some bit of fun about them that I might not have seen earlier, that is now a part of who they are. So anyway, they showed up looking like that, with the little novelty glasses, and he went with them. So that's where this ends today. As you know, or perhaps you don't, but our method is that if we think that any of these stories are ones that we'd like to share publicly in a book, we go back into protected prayer and ask if we might speak to them again, and might we have their permission to use their story. Um, we've always gotten yes. We don't have to. Anybody's free to say yes or no. Sometimes they've been a little circumspect. The main question that people seem to have is, would my story be discovered by any of my loved ones? And if it were, would it be upsetting, or would it reopen a wound? A couple of times people have asked to change their first name to something else. We don't use surnames, and we don't give away data. First of all, we hardly ever get information about hometowns and something like the detail that would be on a death certificate. We don't need that. It's not what this is about. Um, but anyway, we did go back and ask him later if we could use his story in a book, and we'll deal with that next time. One thing that I do want to end on this session with, and I'm sure I'll do it in the next two, is that he said to us, don't let my circumstance cause you to think that your loved one who died of a long illness did what I did. Don't assume that someone that you love that died of a lingering illness necessarily brought it with them, or that metaphor that he used about feeling caged and bringing the cage with him. He said, don't do that. I'm only telling you what my experience was. That doesn't mean it needs to be generalized, or that anyone should uh, make the grief that they feel after the loss of a loved one to an extended illness. Don't make your grief even worse by assuming the worst. Don't do that. So he was very clear on that. Well, anyway, that's it in this episode. I just wanted to tell you his story. If you want to read it in detail, it's chapter 4 of book 3, that a lot of you prefer to go on Amazon and buy the Audible version of that, so you can listen to it while you commute or walk the dog or whatever it is you do. And I think we have more copies of the audiobook sold than we do the paper book. Nevertheless, that's it for this time. Next time, we'll go into what we call compassionate response. So how do we suffer with Professor Lawrence through what he went through, and how do we respond to it? Remember that You can contact me through my website if you want to. That's nathan-castle.com. I ask that if you haven't read any of my books, please don't send me an email asking about them before having read one of them. There's just aren't enough hours in the day for me to do that. But if you've read at least one of them and have questions, then I'm happy to try to arrange a time for us to have a conversation or at least exchange some email. Remember too that I'm praying for you, and if the reason that you're listening to these podcasts is because you're moving through a grief of your own, I want to do what I can to make that easier for you, and I'm including you in my prayers. But for now, this is Father Nathan Castle, host of the Joyful Friar. Grateful for your attention today. God bless you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.